The woman stood alone in the cemetery at dawn, her lips moving in quiet conversation with a weathered headstone, and Harrison Lennox watched from beneath the shadow of a cottonwood tree, his heart unexpectedly stirred by the profound tenderness in her voice. It was August of 1883, and the morning air in Jackson, Wyoming carried the crisp promise of autumn even as summer still clung to the high meadows surrounding the valley. Harrison had ridden into town 3 days prior, looking for work on one of the cattle ranches that dotted the landscape between the Teton Range and the Gros Ventre River. He had not expected to find himself captivated by a woman who spoke to the dead as naturally as others spoke to the living. He had come to the cemetery to visit his own ghosts, the memories of men he had known during his years trailing cattle from Texas to Montana. Good men, most of them, buried far from home in unmarked graves along dusty trails. But the sound of her voice had stopped him before he reached the newer section of the graveyard. She was kneeling beside a simple wooden cross, her dark hair braided down her back, her calico dress faded but clean. Her words carried clearly in the still morning air. "The fence near the creek needs mending again, Thomas," she was saying, her tone matter-of-fact yet affectionate. "I know you always said that section was trouble, what with the spring floods and all. You were right about that, as you were right about most things. I will get to it this week, I promise. The chickens are laying well, and I sold 2 dozen eggs to Mrs. Patterson yesterday. She asked after you, sent her regards. People do not forget, my love. They remember the good you did." Harrison knew he should move on, that this was a private moment, but something in her voice held him transfixed. There was no madness in her words, no desperate grief. She spoke with the comfortable intimacy of a wife discussing daily matters with her husband, as if death were merely a temporary separation, a door closed but not locked. He had known grief himself, had lost people he cared about, but he had never heard anyone speak to the departed with such gentle normalcy. The woman continued, her hand resting on the sun-warmed earth beside the grave. "I know you worry about me being alone out there. I can feel it sometimes, like you are watching over me still. But I manage well enough. You taught me how to shoot straight, how to read the weather, how to keep the accounts. Everything you knew you gave to me freely. I am not afraid, Thomas. I am just lonely sometimes, but that is the price we pay for having loved so well." Harrison felt his throat tighten. 3 years, he thought. The date carved into the cross read 1880. 3 years she had been widowed, and still she came here to speak with her husband as if he might answer. It was not madness, he realized. It was loyalty, devotion, a love that refused to be extinguished by something as mundane as mortality. She stood then, brushing dirt from her skirt, and Harrison stepped back farther into the shadows. But his boot found a dry twig, and the snap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet morning. The woman turned sharply, her hand moving instinctively to her waist where he glimpsed the handle of a small pistol tucked into her belt. "Who is there?" She called out, her voice steady despite the sudden tension in her posture. Harrison stepped forward, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I apologize, madam. I did not mean to startle you. I was paying my own respects." She studied him carefully, her green eyes sharp and assessing. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with a face that would have been soft and pretty if not for the hardness that grief and self-reliance had etched around her mouth and eyes. She did not lower her guard, but neither did she draw the pistol. "You are the new hand they hired at the Carmichael Ranch," she said finally. It was not a question. "Yes, madam, Harrison Lennox. I arrived earlier this week. Violet Osborne." She did not offer her hand, but her posture relaxed slightly. "You have been standing there for some time." There was no point in denying it. Harrison met her gaze directly. "I have. I heard you speaking, and I suppose curiosity got the better of manners. I apologize for the intrusion." He expected anger, embarrassment, perhaps fear. Instead, Violet simply nodded as if his honesty had satisfied some test he had not known he was taking. "Most folks think I am mad," she said quietly. "Coming here every morning talking to a man 3 years dead. I have heard the whispers in town, seen the looks. They pity me, or they think grief has broken my mind." Harrison shook his head slowly. "I do not think you are mad, Mrs. Osborne. I think you loved your husband, and love does not stop just because the heart that returned it has stopped beating. There is no madness in that, only truth." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful armor she wore. For a moment she looked almost vulnerable, surprised, as if no one had spoken such words to her in a very long time. "You are either a kind man or a fool, Mr. Lennox." "Perhaps both," he admitted with a slight smile. "I have been called worse." A ghost of humor touched her lips, there and gone in an instant. "I must get back to my property. There is work to be done, and daylight does not wait for sentiment." She glanced back at the grave one more time, her expression softening. "Goodbye, Thomas. I will return tomorrow." She walked past Harrison without another word, heading toward the edge of town where a small wagon waited, hitched to a sturdy bay horse. Harrison watched her go, aware that something had shifted in him during that brief exchange. He had drifted for years after leaving his family's ranch in Colorado, working cattle drives and temporary positions, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. The restlessness had suited him, or so he had told himself. But watching Violet Osborne walk away, her back straight and her step determined despite the weight of solitude she carried, he felt an unfamiliar pull, a desire to stay, to know more. Over the following weeks, Harrison found himself rising early, finishing his chores at the Carmichael Ranch with unusual efficiency so he could ride into town at dawn. He told himself he was simply checking on his horse's shoes at the blacksmith or needed supplies from the general store, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. He wanted to see her, to hear that quiet voice speaking into the morning stillness. He never intruded again, never let her know he was there, but he listened from a respectful distance, learning the contours of a love story that had been interrupted but not ended. Thomas Osborne, he learned through Violet's one-sided conversations, had been a homesteader and a dreamer. He had brought Violet to Jackson when it was barely more than a handful of buildings, and had claimed land near the creek where the grass grew tall and sweet. He had been a reader, a man who valued knowledge and shared it freely. He had taught at the small schoolhouse in winter and worked his land in summer. He had died suddenly, a fever that had swept through the valley, taking the young and strong as readily as the old and weak. Violet had nursed him through 5 terrible days, and then she had buried him and carried on alone. Harrison learned, too, that she was stubborn and practical, that she fixed her own roof and broke her own horses, that she refused charity but traded fairly, that she was respected even by those who thought her eccentric. She was surviving, but just barely, her property slowly falling into disrepair despite her efforts, the weight of maintaining a homestead alone gradually crushing her strength if not her spirit. It was a Saturday in mid-September when their paths crossed again, this time at the general store. Harrison was purchasing tobacco and ammunition when Violet entered, a basket over her arm. She nodded to him politely, her expression neutral, and moved to the counter to conduct her business. He overheard her discussion with the shopkeeper, a portly man named Daniels who ran the store with his wife. "I am sorry, Mrs. Osborne, but I cannot extend more credit," Daniels was saying, his voice low but not unkind. You already owe $17 and my suppliers are pressing me. If you could pay even half of what you owe. Violet's voice was quiet but firm. The cattle will be ready to sell in 6 weeks, Mr. Daniels. You know I am good for the money. I have never failed to pay my debts. I know, and I hate to press you, but times are hard for everyone. Perhaps if you considered selling the property, moving into town. There is room at the boarding house and Mrs. Patterson could use help with. No. The single word carried the weight of absolute finality. That land is mine and Thomas's. I will not abandon it. I will find another way. Harrison stepped forward before he could think better of it. Put Mrs. Osborne's purchases on my account, Daniels, and credit the $17 she owes to me as well. Both Violet and the shopkeeper turned to stare at him. Daniels looked confused, but Violet's eyes flashed with something between gratitude and anger. I do not accept charity, Mr. Lennox. Then do not think of it as charity, Harrison replied evenly. Think of it as an investment. I understand you need help with your property. I am willing to work for you in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. The bunkhouse at Carmichael's is crowded and loud, and I could use some peace. Whatever you might have spent on my wages, you can put toward paying me back. Fair trade. It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. Violet's jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would refuse outright. But then something in her expression shifted, pragmatism winning out over pride. The cabin has a small lean-to attached where Thomas stored tools. It is dry and there is room for a bedroll. I can provide 2 meals a day and whatever help you need with your own affairs. In return, you will help repair the fences, clear the irrigation channels, and prepare the cattle for market. When they sell, I will repay what you have advanced today with interest. No interest necessary, Harrison said. Just fair work for fair compensation. Violet hesitated, then extended her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a woman who worked as hard as any man. Very well, Mr. Lennox. We have an agreement. Daniels completed the transaction, clearly relieved to have the outstanding debt resolved, and Harrison carried Violet's supplies to her wagon. They rode in silence back to her property, which sat 3 miles outside town in a small valley where the creek ran clear and fast. The cabin was simple but well built, chinked logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The surrounding land showed signs of neglect, fences sagging and fields overgrown, but the bones of a good homestead were evident. Thomas built most of this himself, Violet said as they unloaded the wagon. He had a gift for seeing what could be, rather than what was. He always said this land would support us, provide for our children when they came. We had 3 years together. It was not enough, but it was more than many people ever have. Harrison carried a sack of flour into the cabin, noting the neatness within. Everything was clean and ordered, though the furniture was sparse. A large bed dominated one corner, quilts carefully folded. A table and 2 chairs sat near the hearth. Books lined a shelf on the far wall, more volumes than Harrison had expected to see in a homesteader's cabin. Violet followed his gaze. Thomas loved to read. He believed an educated mind was the greatest tool a person could possess. He taught me to read properly, to understand not just the words but the ideas behind them. I still read from his collection every night. It helps me feel close to him. She spoke without self-consciousness, as if discussing her daily routine rather than revealing the depths of her loneliness. Harrison set the flour on the counter and turned to face her. You must have loved him very much. I did, Violet said simply. I still do. I know that seems foolish to some, holding on to a ghost, but he was my best friend, my teacher, my partner in all things. How do you stop loving someone simply because they are no longer present? The love does not die with the person. It remains, and it must go somewhere. Harrison thought about the years he had spent drifting, avoiding connections that might root him in place, telling himself that freedom was more valuable than belonging. Looking at Violet, seeing the strength and sorrow woven together in her, he wondered if he had been wrong. "It does not seem foolish to me," he said quietly. "It seems brave." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Violet nodded once briskly, as if sealing a pact. "The lean-to is through that door. I will prepare supper at sundown. We start work at first light." Harrison settled into a routine over the following weeks that felt more natural than any life he had known. He rose with the sun and worked until dusk, mending fences and clearing channels, chopping wood and repairing the barn roof. Violet worked alongside him, never asking him to do anything she was not willing to do herself. She was capable and tireless, though Harrison often noticed the weariness in her eyes, the weight of 3 years of solitary struggle evident in the tightness of her shoulders. They spoke little during the day, focused on the work, but in the evenings, over simple meals of beans and cornbread, venison stew and fresh bread, they talked. Violet told him about Thomas, about their courtship in Missouri and their decision to come west, about the dreams they had shared. Harrison found himself telling her things he had never spoken aloud, about growing up the youngest of 5 brothers, about leaving home when he realized there would be no inheritance for him, no place in the family business, about the years of wandering and the growing sense that he was running from something rather than toward anything. "You are still young," Violet said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge over the mountains. "You have time to find what you are searching for." "How old are you?" Harrison asked, realizing he did not know. 27 this past June, and you?" 29. "Old enough to know better," my mother would say, "yet here I am, still figuring things out." Violet smiled, a real smile that transformed her face, making her look younger, lighter. "I think we are all figuring things out, Mr. Lennox. Thomas used to say that certainty was the enemy of wisdom, that the moment you thought you had all the answers was the moment you stopped growing. He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I have ever known," Violet said quietly. Then she glanced at Harrison, something uncertain in her expression. "Or he was until recently." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Harrison felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "I am glad you think well of me." "I do," Violet admitted. "Perhaps more than I should. It has been 3 years since Thomas died, but some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like a lifetime. I talk to him still, as you know. I tell him about the work we have done, about the progress on the property. I told him about you." Harrison's throat felt tight. "What did you tell him?" "That you listen without judgment, that you work hard and speak honestly, that you make me laugh sometimes, which I had forgotten how to do." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "That I feel guilty for enjoying your company, as if taking pleasure in the present somehow dishonors the past." Harrison reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her restless hands with one of his own. "I do not think love is finite, Mrs. Osborne. I think the heart has room for more than one truth. You can honor your husband's memory and still allow yourself to live. I think, if he loved you as much as you loved him, he would want you to be happy." Tears welled in Violet's eyes, the first Harrison had seen her shed. "How can you be so understanding? Most men would find it strange, a woman who still speaks to her dead husband." "I am not most men," Harrison said simply. "And there is nothing strange about fidelity, about keeping faith with someone you promised forever to. If anything, it tells me that you are a woman who keeps her promises, who loves completely. Those are not flaws, Violet. They are gifts." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she did not correct him. Instead, she turned her hand beneath his, their palms pressing together, fingers intertwining. They sat that way for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, neither speaking, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning, Harrison accompanied Violet to the cemetery. She had not invited him, but when he saddled his horse alongside hers, she simply nodded acceptance. They rode through the dawn-lit valley, mist rising from the creek, the mountains catching fire as the sun crested their peaks. At the graveyard, Violet dismounted and walked to Thomas's grave as she always did. Harrison stayed back, respectful of the ritual, but this time Violet turned and gestured for him to join her. He approached slowly, hat in his hands, and stood beside her as she knelt by the weathered cross. "Good morning, Thomas," she began, her voice carrying the familiar warmth and affection. "I have brought someone to meet you. This is Harrison Lennox. He has been helping with the property these past weeks, getting us ready for winter. The fences are mended, the barn roof no longer leaks, and the cattle are fat and healthy. We will get a good price for them." She paused, her hand resting on the grave. "I know you would like him, my love. He is kind and hardworking, and he treats me with respect. He does not think I am mad for talking to you. He understands that love does not end, that you are still part of my life even though you are no longer here." Her voice wavered slightly. "I think you would approve of him, Thomas. I think you would be glad I am not alone anymore." Harrison felt the weight of the moment, the solemnity and the grace of it. Without fully understanding why, he knelt beside Violet, his own hand reaching out to touch the sun-warmed earth of the grave. "I never knew you, sir, but I know you through her words and through the life you built together. You are a lucky man to have earned such love, and I promise you I will honor your memory by doing right by her. I will never ask her to forget you or to love you less. There is room enough in this world for both the past and the future." Violet turned to look at him, tears streaming freely down her face now. "Harrison," she whispered, and then she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long denied. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort as 3 years of bottled grief finally found release. When the storm passed, Violet pulled back slightly, her eyes red but clear. "I am sorry. I did not mean to break down like that." "Do not apologize," Harrison said gently. "You have been strong for so long. Everyone needs to let go sometimes." She managed a watery smile. "Thomas used to say the same thing. He was always trying to get me to admit when I needed help, to accept that I could not do everything alone." She looked back at the grave, her expression tender. "I think he sent you to me, Harrison. I think somehow he knew I needed you, and he found a way to bring you here." Harrison did not know if he believed in such things, in signs and divine intervention, but he did not argue. If believing that gave Violet peace, if it helped her reconcile her past with her present, then he would accept it. "Perhaps he did," he said softly. "And if so, I am grateful to him for it." They stayed a while longer, Violet speaking more easily now, telling Thomas about their plans for the winter, about the barn cat that had delivered kittens, about the way the aspen were turning gold on the mountainsides. Harrison added a few words of his own, feeling less foolish than he had expected, speaking to a man he had never met, but had come to respect through the legacy he had left behind. As autumn deepened into the first cold snaps of winter, Harrison and Violet's relationship shifted from employer and employee to something more complex and precious. They worked together with the ease of long practice, anticipating each other's needs, communicating as much through gesture and glance as through words. In the evenings, they sat closer on the porch, even as the temperatures dropped, reluctant to give up the peaceful ritual. Harrison moved from the lean-to into the cabin as the nights grew colder, sleeping on a pallet near the fire while Violet kept her place in the large bed. But increasingly, Harrison woke in the darkest hours before dawn to find Violet sitting by the dying embers, wrapped in a quilt, staring into the coals. He learned that nightmares plagued her, memories of Thomas's final days, the fever that had consumed him, the helplessness she had felt. On those nights, Harrison would rise and sit beside her, saying nothing, just offering his presence until the ghosts retreated and she could sleep again. The cattle sold well in late October, bringing enough money to pay off all of Violet's debts and put aside a small reserve for the winter. She insisted on repaying Harrison the money he had advanced at the store, and though he protested, she was adamant. "A deal is a deal, and I keep my word," she said firmly. "Besides, you have earned far more than this through your labor. I could not have managed the sale without you." "So what happens now?" Harrison asked, though he dreaded the answer. Their arrangement had been temporary, tied to preparing the cattle for market. With that accomplished, he had no excuse to stay. Violet looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "That depends on what you want, Harrison. Winter is coming. The pass will be snowed in soon and travel will be difficult. You could head south, find work on a ranch in a warmer climate. Or," she hesitated, then continued with quiet determination, "or you could stay here. The property can support 2 people. We work well together. I trust you, which is not something I say lightly. If you wanted to stay as a partner in the homestead rather than a hired hand, I would welcome it." Harrison's heart hammered in his chest. "As a partner." "As whatever you want to be," Violet said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will not lie to you, Harrison. I care for you deeply. More deeply than I thought possible after Thomas. But I will not pressure you, will not assume that my feelings are returned. If you want to stay as a business partner, a friend, I will accept that and be grateful for it. But if you want more—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Harrison closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I want more," he said hoarsely. "I want everything. I want to wake up in this cabin every morning and know I am home. I want to work this land with you and build something lasting. I want to hear you laugh and hold you when you cry. I want to stand beside you at Thomas's grave and honor his memory while we build our own life together. If you will have me, Violet, I am yours." She kissed him then, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him close. It was not a tentative kiss, not uncertain or hesitant, but full of hunger and hope and the fierce joy of 2 lonely people finding each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Violet was smiling through fresh tears. "I will have you," she said. "God help me. I will have you and keep you and love you for as long as we both draw breath." That night, Harrison moved his belongings from the pallet by the fire to the large bed Violet had shared with Thomas. It felt momentous and terrifying, crossing that threshold, but Violet took his hand and led him there without hesitation. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning the shape and taste of each other, building new memories to sit alongside the old. Afterward, lying tangled together beneath the quilts, Violet spoke into the darkness. "I will always love Thomas. He will always be part of me." "I know," Harrison replied, his lips brushing her temple. "And I will never ask you to change that. He was your first love, and he deserves to be remembered." "But you are my second love," Violet continued, her voice thick with emotion. "And that is its own kind of miracle. I did not think I would ever feel this way again, did not think my heart had room for it. But here you are, and here I am, and it feels right. It feels like Thomas would approve, like he is giving us his blessing." Harrison tightened his arms around her, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. "Then we will make him proud," he promised. "We will build a good life here, one worthy of the foundation he laid." Winter descended on Jackson with howling winds and deep snows, but inside the cabin, Harrison and Violet were warm and content. They married in late November, a simple ceremony at the small church in town with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Violet wore a dress of deep blue that had belonged to her mother, and she carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers to Thomas's grave before the ceremony, placing them on the headstone with a whispered conversation that Harrison did not try to overhear. When she returned to his side, her eyes were clear and peaceful. "I told him we were getting married. I told him I would always carry him in my heart, but that I was ready to open my life to new love. I think he understands." The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Michaels who had known Thomas, spoke kindly about the nature of love and loss, about the bravery it took to risk one's heart again after grief. Thomas Osborne was a good man, and he would not want his beloved wife to spend her life alone in sorrow, he said, his voice carrying warmth and conviction. "Love is not diminished by death, but neither is it obligated to die with the beloved. It transforms, it makes room, it grows." What we celebrate today is not a betrayal of what was, but an affirmation that love itself endures. Harrison and Violet spoke their vows with hands clasped tight, promising fidelity, partnership, and devotion. When Harrison slipped a simple gold band onto Violet's finger, she smiled up at him with such radiant happiness that he felt his chest constrict with the force of his love for her. The winter months passed in a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment. They rose early and tended to the animals, chopped wood and hauled water, cooked meals and read together by firelight. Harrison discovered that Violet had a gift for storytelling, that she could bring the characters in books to life with her dramatic readings. She discovered that Harrison had a fine singing voice, that he knew dozens of old ballads and trail songs that made her laugh or cry depending on the verses. On clear mornings, they rode into town together to visit Thomas's grave. It became a ritual they shared, Violet speaking to her first husband while Harrison stood beside her, sometimes adding his own words, more often simply bearing witness. The townspeople, who had once whispered about the widow who talked to the dead, gradually came to accept and even admire the unusual triangle of love that bound Violet to both her past and her present. "You are good for her," Mrs. Patterson told Harrison one day at the general store. "She was fading before you came, working herself into an early grave trying to keep that property running alone. Now she has color in her cheeks again, life in her eyes. Thomas would be grateful to you for that." Harrison accepted the words with quiet grace, understanding that he had been given a rare gift. The trust of a woman who had loved deeply and lost terribly, the chance to build something beautiful on the foundation of tragedy and resilience. Spring came early to the valley, melting the snows and coaxing green shoots from the thawing earth. Violet announced in April that she was pregnant, her hand resting protectively over her still flat belly, her expression a mixture of joy and trepidation. "I am happy," she told Harrison, "but also frightened. What if something goes wrong? What if I lose you the way I lost Thomas?" Harrison pulled her close, feeling the fragility of life and the courage it took to embrace it anyway. "We cannot live in fear of what might happen, Violet. We can only cherish what we have right now in this moment. I am healthy and strong, and I plan to be around for a very long time. Our child will grow up knowing both their parents, learning from both of us, loved fiercely and completely." "Both parents," Violet repeated, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I like the sound of that. As her pregnancy progressed, Harrison took on more of the heavy labor, insisting that Violet rest and preserve her strength. She protested at first, unused to being coddled, but eventually accepted his care with grace. They spent long evenings planning for the baby, choosing names and preparing the cabin. Harrison built a beautiful cradle from ash wood, carving designs into the headboard. Mountains and stars, a creek and wildflowers, all the elements of the land they loved. Violet's visits to Thomas's grave continued throughout her pregnancy. She told him about the baby, about her hopes and fears, about how Harrison was building a cradle and reading books about childbirth, so he could be prepared to help if the midwife could not reach them in time. "I wish you could meet our child," she said one warm June morning, her hand resting on the grave. "I wish they could know you, hear your stories, learn from your wisdom. But I will tell them about you, Thomas. I will make sure they know that love comes in many forms, that family is not always simple or straightforward, but that it is always worth fighting for." Harrison, standing beside her, added his own words. "I will make sure your memory stays alive in this family, Thomas. Your books, your teachings, the values you held dear, they will all be passed down. This child will know they come from good people, from love that endures beyond death itself." In late September, as the aspen turned gold once more, Violet went into labor. The midwife arrived just after dawn, a capable woman named Sarah who had delivered half the babies in Jackson. Harrison paced the porch, his nerves stretched tight, listening to the sounds from within the cabin. When the baby's first cry split the air, he felt his knees go weak with relief. Sarah emerged an hour later, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Lennox, a big, healthy boy with a strong set of lungs. Your wife is tired but doing well. You can go in now." Harrison entered the cabin to find Violet propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle against her chest. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, his small fists waving in the air, his eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. Harrison approached slowly, awe washing over him at the sight of his wife and son. "He is perfect," Violet whispered. "Harrison, look what we made. Look at this beautiful life." Harrison sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one finger reaching out to stroke the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "He is a miracle. You are a miracle. What should we name him?" Violet looked up at her husband, then down at her son. "I was thinking we might name him Thomas after the man who brought us together. Thomas Harrison Lennox. He will carry both your names, honor both the past and the future." Harrison felt emotion well up in his chest, gratitude and love so powerful it stole his breath. "Thomas Harrison Lennox," he repeated. "It is a strong name, a good name. He will be proud to wear it." That afternoon, when Violet had rested and the baby was sleeping peacefully in his new cradle, Harrison carried them both out to the wagon. Violet looked at him questioningly, but he simply smiled. "There is someone who needs to meet his namesake." They rode slowly to the cemetery, the autumn sun warm on their shoulders, the mountains standing sentinel around them. At Thomas's grave, Harrison helped Violet down, and she carried the baby to the weathered cross, kneeling carefully in the grass. "Thomas," she said softly, "I want you to meet someone very special. This is Thomas Harrison Lennox, your namesake and our son. He was born this morning, healthy and strong. He has his father's dark hair and my eyes, or so the midwife says. I cannot quite tell yet." She smiled through tears, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope you are proud wherever you are. I hope you can see that the love you gave me did not die with you. It grew and transformed and became something new and beautiful. You will always be part of this family, Thomas. This child will grow up knowing your name, reading your books, learning the values you held dear. You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten." Harrison knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his free hand resting gently on the baby's back. "Thank you, Thomas," he said quietly. "Thank you for loving her so well that she knew how to love again. Thank you for building a life here that I could step into and help continue. Thank you for whatever part you played in bringing us together. I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you have given me." They sat there for a long time, the three of them four, if you counted the presence they both felt hovering near, watching over them with love and approval. When they finally rose to leave, Violet placed her hand one last time on the grave, her touch lingering, reverent. "Goodbye, my first love," she whispered. "Watch over us." The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Violet continued to visit the cemetery, though less frequently as her life filled with the demands of motherhood and partnership. Harrison built their homestead into one of the most prosperous in the valley, expanding the herd and improving the land. They had two more children, a daughter named Grace and another son they called James, and the cabin had to be expanded twice to accommodate the growing family. Thomas the younger learned early about the man he was named for, about the uncle in heaven who had loved his mother first, who had built the cabin they lived in and collected the books they read. Far from finding it strange, the boy took pride in his name and his legacy. "I have two fathers," he told his younger siblings. "One who watches from heaven and one who teaches me here. I am lucky." Violet and Harrison celebrated their 10th anniversary in the small church where they had married, surrounded by their children and friends. That morning they visited the cemetery together, the whole family making the journey. The wooden cross had been replaced years earlier with a proper stone marker, paid for jointly by Violet and Harrison, engraved with simple words: Thomas Osborne, beloved husband, teacher, dreamer. His love endures. Young Thomas placed wildflowers on the grave, as did Grace and James, each child murmuring their own greetings to the man they knew through stories. Violet knelt as she always did, her hair now threaded with silver, her face marked by laugh lines and sun exposure, but her eyes still the same brilliant green. "We are doing well, Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the comfort of ritual. "The children are healthy and happy. The land prospers. Harrison is everything you could have hoped for me, everything I needed. I still miss you, especially on quiet mornings when the light comes through the mountains just so, or when I read from your books and remember your voice. But the missing does not hurt the way it once did. It has become something gentler, a sweet ache rather than a sharp wound. I have been blessed twice in this life, loved by two extraordinary men. Not everyone can say that." Harrison stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, their children gathered close. "She is right, you know," he said to the grave. "She has been loved well, and she loves well in return. Our children know their worth because she teaches them daily about dignity and devotion. Thank you for helping to shape her into the woman she is. Thank you for the legacy you left that we get to build upon." They walked back to the wagon together, a family woven from loss and hope, tragedy and triumph. Harrison lifted young Thomas onto the seat, then helped Violet up, his hand lingering on hers. She smiled at him, the smile that never failed to make his heart skip, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man alive. "I love you," he said, the words as fresh and vital as the first time he had spoken them. "I love you too," Violet replied. "Both of you." Harrison understood. There was no jealousy in him, no insecurity or resentment. He had learned long ago that love was not a competition, that the heart's capacity was infinite when you allowed it to be. Violet loved him completely. and she loved Thomas's memory completely, and there was no contradiction in that. It was simply the truth of who she was, the woman who spoke to a husband 3 years dead, and the cowboy who listened and never called her mad. As they rode back toward home, the sun westering over the mountains, their children chattering in the wagon bed, Harrison felt a peace settle over him that he had never known in all his years of wandering. This was where he belonged. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. A woman who loved fiercely and honestly, children who looked at him with trust and affection, land that responded to careful stewardship, a community that respected him, a life built on foundation stones of loss and resilience. That evening, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Harrison and Violet sat on the porch as they had done countless times before, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool with the promise of autumn, and Violet leaned against Harrison's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking on a widow who talked to ghosts, a ready-made family with all its complications." Harrison pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Not for one single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Violet. You and our children and this life we have built together. I would not change a thing. Not even the part where you share me with a memory." "Especially not that part," Harrison said firmly, "because that memory is part of what makes you who you are. Your capacity to love, to remain faithful, to honor what came before while embracing what is now, those are not burdens. They are gifts. Thomas was a lucky man to have earned your love, and I am a lucky man to be trusted with it now." Violet turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face in the dim light. "How did I get so fortunate, to find true love twice in one lifetime?" "The same way I got fortunate enough to find it once," Harrison replied. "Grace, timing, and the courage to take a chance on something that scared us both." She kissed him then, slow and sweet, a kiss that tasted of gratitude and promise. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for never making me choose between my past and my future." "You never have to choose," Harrison assured her. "We carry it all together. The joy and the sorrow, the memories and the dreams, everything that makes us who we are. That is what love does. It makes room." They sat together as the night deepened, two souls who had found each other against all odds, building a life that honored both grief and joy, memory and hope. In the cemetery 3 miles away, a headstone stood silent witness to a love that had never truly ended, only transformed. And in the cabin surrounded by mountains and stars, a family slept peacefully, rooted in land and legacy, bound together by a love story that had begun with tragedy and bloomed into something extraordinary. Harrison Lennox, the drifting cowboy who had stopped beneath a cottonwood tree and listened to a woman speak to the dead, had found his home. Not in a place, though the valley was beautiful and the land was good, but in the heart of a woman brave enough to love again, wise enough to know that love in all its forms was worth celebrating, strong enough to build a future without forgetting the past. And Violet Osborne Lennox, the widow who had refused to let death silence her devotion, had found a partner worthy of the second chance she had been given. Together, they proved that love was not finite, that the heart could hold multiple truths, that honoring the dead and living fully were not opposing forces but complementary acts of courage. Years later, when Harrison himself was old and gray, their children grown with families of their own, he would sometimes accompany Violet to the cemetery and listen as she spoke to Thomas in that same gentle, conversational tone. And he would add his own words of gratitude, thanking the man he had never met but had come to respect and honor, the man whose love had shaped the woman Harrison treasured above all else. When Violet finally passed at the age of 72, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the cabin she had shared with two great loves, her last words were spoken to both of them. "I am coming, Thomas. Wait for me. And Harrison, my darling, I will love you until the stars go dark and beyond. Thank you for the most beautiful life." Harrison held her hand as she slipped away, grief and gratitude warring in his chest. She was buried between the two men who had defined her life, a new stone placed to match Thomas's, her name linking theirs in death as she had linked them in life. Violet Osborne Lennox. Beloved wife, mother, dreamer. Her love endures. Harrison lived another 8 years, tending the land and watching over their growing family. He visited the cemetery every morning, speaking to both Violet and Thomas, keeping them apprised of the children's accomplishments, the grandchildren's milestones, the changing seasons. And when his own time came, he was laid to rest beside Violet, completing the triangle of love that had begun so many years earlier beneath a cottonwood tree. Their children made sure all 3 stones were maintained, the inscriptions kept clear, the flowers always fresh. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light came through the mountains just so, visitors to the cemetery would swear they could hear voices on the wind. A woman speaking with tender affection, and 2 men responding with love and laughter, the conversation continuing beyond death, beyond time, eternal as the mountains that watched over them all.